On this episode of Never Better Than Late, I talk with comedian Dan Geurin. Dan began doing comedy at age 40 as a married father of two with a full-time job as a teacher. Despite that busy life, Dan's work ethic and sense of urgency to get better quickly saw him get on stage more than 200 times his first year. Now, 10 years into his comedy career, Dan talks about his plans as he approaches retirement from his 9-to-5 job. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Never Better Than Late. My guest today is Albany, New York-based comedian Dan Geurin. Dan, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Yeah, we saw each other in October. You were in Binghamton, in my town, to do a show.
Yeah, that was great. It was a good time.
I was thinking today, I don't think we've ever been on a show together.
We did perform one time in Cohoes at a bar show. It was a
Okay.
little room, and that's where I think I first met you in person, just in the back room waiting to go on. It was
That's
I
right.
can't even remember when it was. It was years ago, but it was just a little bar show, maybe 5 comics on it, and you had come out to our area, which you do quite a bit. And yeah, it was the first time I met you. But I had seen you on social media, and like we see, you see people's schedules, and you see people working, and you see people doing different stuff. So I had definitely heard about you, and I'm always interested in other comics who are older. And I guess that's what this is about, is comedians who started older and who are kind of in that, especially in the beginning stages when all we're doing is open mics and just starting out.
Right.
We kind of, there aren't that many of us, over 40 that started that late.
Yeah. I had forgot about that show. That was a tiny little place. That's right. Speaking of which, I was thinking about this the other day. When you started out, and you were, what age were you, first of all, when you started out?
I was 40. It was in the fall of 2012. First time on stage was November 5th. I was taking a comedy class, and our graduation show was coming up. I think it was November 14th. That was on a Wednesday, and the biggest mic in Albany area was the Lark Tavern mic on Mondays. So our teacher encouraged us to go to that, even if we weren't going to sign up, and go up just to see what an open mic was and check it out. So I ended up going up November 5th of 2012.
So what was the class you were taking? Where was that through, and who was teaching that class?
It was taught by a guy named Russ Davignon, who was a local comedian and who had produced some shows through a brand called Comic Syndrome. This was before I started, and he wasn't really in it much longer after I started, but it was basically a continuing education class at one of the local high schools, and my wife saw it in the flyer. I had been taking guitar lessons just as something to do to get out of the house. I had always had an interest in learning to play an instrument. So, the continuing ed is a great way to take classes, because it's not that big of a financial investment. It's usually close, and it's a good way. So the new flyer came out, and my wife saw there was a comedy 101 class, and it said that at the end of the class they perform a show. And I had always been a fan of stand-up comedy and sketch comedy, so my wife was like, you should check this out, you should try it. So I ended up taking the class, and it was like a 6-week class, and there was nothing miraculous taught in the class, but it did give us some direction in terms of, like, these are different styles of stand-up comedy, these are some of the jokes that other comedians tell, different styles. These are some of the resources you can get, joke writing books and, comedy books like the Comedy Bible and stuff. And these are a list of the local open mics. So it kind of just got us started. It was a world that I didn't know existed. I didn't really know anything about comedy open mics or what it was like to start from the ground level as a performer.
That's a pretty common story with people I've talked to that don't grow up in a huge scene. I mean, Albany has a healthy scene, but it's not New York City. It's not Los Angeles. So a lot of people's reason for not starting a little bit earlier was they just really weren't aware of how you started, or even whether you had a scene. So you found that class helpful, because I know people debate about whether comedy classes are useful or not, but it was a good intro.
It was a good way to get started. What I found out after I took the class is that a lot of people that take the class, it's kind of a buck. Like, I always wanted to try stand-up comedy. They take the class, do the graduation show, and then they never do it again. It's something they kind of just check off the list. Whereas I had no idea that, I had never met a local comedian. I never knew anybody in my life who was a comedian. I actually did know somebody's brother who was a comedian in New York City, but I thought that if you wanted a career in show business, you'd have to go to a major city to start. And I was anchored in as a teacher. I was married with 2 kids. So for me, it was never something I had even realistically thought about because I was living my life as a teacher and a dad and a husband, and it just never occurred to me that it was something I could do.
Right. So your wife wasn't encouraging you to take that because it was quieter than guitar. That wasn't her. That wasn't.
It was just something that she knew I always wanted to do, and I really did. Starting to take the guitar lessons as my kids got a little bit older, they were a little bit more independent. So just doing stuff to slide out of the house one night a week to try something and kind of get a creative fix. And I really enjoyed that. But then once I started doing comedy, the guitar stuff wasn't important, at all. It was just like it was a complete, I really found something that I really enjoyed in terms of the writing and the performing. So I've heard people say that if you stay busy and you keep trying new things, it will lead to other things. It's not always necessarily a straight path. So I would encourage anybody who's, if you have an itch to be creative, to take an art class or learn an instrument or maybe a writing class. There's a lot more resources, especially with the online world that we live in now, to access people. You always see commercials for masterclass and just about every subject. So I would encourage anybody that if you have something that you had always thought about or just something that interests you, then to pursue it, because it might lead to you finding other things that you really like.
Yeah, definitely. So you talked about always being a fan of comedy. How far back can you go where you remember maybe as a kid, the first comedy that kind of took root with you? And did you ever have any thoughts growing up? I think we've talked about it already of doing anything in comedy, or were you just a fan?
I always loved comedy. I was always a fan of stand up. I grew up in the 70s and 80s when the HBO special was like really meant something. And there was a lot of different styles of comedy. There were people doing one man shows. There were always like the Rodney Dangerfield young comedian specials. There were people like George Carlin, Richard Pryor, you would see do hours. And as access, my parents didn't really have a restriction of us watching stuff on TV. So I was watching George Carlin as a kid and Richard Pryor as a kid and the young comedian specials as a kid. And then as cable got more advanced, as around 10, 11, 12 years old, we started getting access to all these different shows like Evening at the Improv, and Comedy Central popped up later, and you'd see people do 7 minutes on TV. And I always enjoyed the comedians on the Tonight Show. Always was a fan of sketch shows like Saturday Night Live. So always a big fan of comedy, and my whole family was. We're kind of a funny family, and but I never thought that I could do it in terms of like it just didn't seem realistic to pursue a life in show business. It just seemed very foreign to me. I always loved it, always appreciated it, but as a fan, and
Mhm.
never really seriously considered it. But I was told I was funny my whole life, by people growing up, and was always making jokes, making fun, always reciting the funny movies and the stand up of people that we watched with other kids at school, and a lot of my friends were fans of stand up as well.
So coming up in school, who was maybe that first comic that you and your friends latched onto and you would retell the jokes?
I was always a George Carlin fan
Okay.
growing up, and really loved his stuff. And he always had a balance of like really profound political, really smart stuff, but also silly, funny stuff too. And always loved Richard Pryor with the characters and more story driven comedy. And at the time, now that I'm a comedian, I kind of know what they do. Like I know different comedy styles, and how different comedians kind of find the laughs and stuff. So I didn't know it at the time, but I really did like. I didn't know how to describe it, but I knew that I liked certain comedians for different reasons. Robin Williams was always big growing up too, and he had a completely different style than other comedians, more improv. And then watching the cable shows on TV, you would see a lot of up and coming comedians who would later go on to be famous, do maybe their first 7 minutes on TV. And yeah, I was a big fan of those comedians. What I've learned since is that the comedians I was most drawn to were comedians who were really strong writers. I always preferred writers over performers in terms of somebody with really strong material than somebody who's funny off the cuff. And I didn't even know it at the time, but I've since learned from becoming a comedian and a writer that that's what I was always drawn to.
That's interesting. I think I was drawn to that the same way. And I definitely felt when I started, I had a little bit more confidence in my writing ability. I always felt like what was going to need to catch up was the performance part of it,
Yeah,
and which just comes from experience. But those first few, probably those first few years are agonizing
right.
because you feel lost. Well, you've brought up a few names, some of the classics, Carlin and Dangerfield and Richard Pryor. I'm a little bit older than you, but I think we hit a nice era when we were growing up because those older guys were still around. They were still coming on the Tonight Show. But then as you got into the 80s, you mentioned some of the different styles. Then suddenly you had people, Stephen Wright, what a weird
Right.
breath of fresh air, and Emo Phillips and Robin Williams too with the improv stuff. I really like that I caught that era with that mix of old and new. And just for comedy fans too, I've discovered this if people don't know, Amazon Prime has all of those old episodes of A&E Evening at the Improv.
Yeah, I've checked in and watched some of them, and it's funny because some of the people we've worked with and become friends with over the years, and it was them when they were young and starting out. So it was really interesting to see what their first 7 minutes was, their first strong
Yeah.
7 minutes, and it kind of shows different ebbs and flows of comedy at the times because you would see comedians from certain eras, and some of them would be very similar. You know, they would kind of have a very similar kind of style to each other. But then again, too, there was some experimental stuff going on too. Like you talked about Stephen Wright being different, Emo Phillips being different, and a lot of people. I look some at some of the old Boston stuff that I can get my hands on, and like Bobcat Goldthwait was very different, and even Louis C.K. when he first started out. There's some footage of him on YouTube when he's 18, 19 years old, and he's doing real strange experimental
Mm.
kind of alt comedy in a big room and not killing, but the stuff's not really designed to kill. He's just doing really different stuff, everything from sound effects to physical stuff to just different. So I think there was kind of a mold, and then you saw people who were very different than that, and they kind of stood out.
Yeah, I think people make that comment now when they look back 30, 40 years, and you can kind of say, well, that's sort of an 80s style of comedy or something because everyone's influenced by what's around them at the time, whether they want to be or not.
I was just going to say I'm strongly influenced by the 80s stuff. I definitely am. It definitely informs my style of comedy. For somebody who's 10 years in versus maybe a kid who started at 20 who's 30 now and they're 10 years in, because we had different influences. I don't know how that affects you. Probably similar to me.
Yeah, I think so. And it's just great that you absorb all those things. That's one advantage of starting later too, is I think you had an extra, what, maybe 20 years of just absorbing comedy by osmosis,
Right.
whether you're consciously thinking about it. And maybe when you start, you have a little bit of a, maybe a little bit of a guide to where you want to go. Did you? Because I found myself when I started, probably like everybody else, imitating people I liked, and it
Absolutely.
didn't necessarily fit what I really ended up doing on stage or how I ended up writing. And we all have that time period of
Sure.
however much time. Was there someone you kind of went on stage with the first time molding yourself after?
Yeah, I didn't know I was doing it at the time, but one of my comedian like the my favorite comedians of all time is a guy named Drake Sather,
Oh
who is
yeah.
known more as a writer than like comedians know who Drake is, and everybody knows how funny he was, but most of the people like mainstream not super comedy fans would know his work. Like he was a writer on Zoolander, and he did a lot of writing in Hollywood that he kind of is known for in the industry. But as a stand-up, he made me laugh so hard. And I think he only has like 20 or 30 minutes available to watch. There's the young comedian special, and there's a few sets on YouTube, 20 or 30. And he's really well written one-liners that were dark and dirty and hilarious. And I kind of wrote jokes like that in the beginning for the open mics when I didn't really have a personality on stage. And I was kind of writing jokes in the voice of Drake Sather. And I didn't know that at the time. And then I look back on it and I'm like, that's what I was doing. Who a lot of other people who are influenced by Norm Macdonald would really like Drake's stuff because they work closely together and
Yes.
were friends. And if anybody out there who's a comedy fan and you're a fan of Norm, look up Drake Sather and you'll be very impressed with what he was doing, especially when he was relatively new as a comedian. He's very funny, like so smart, such a good writer, such good joke structure, and that's what I was trying to do. And It would work. I would come up with a joke here or there. They would be dirty. The first sets that I first did, a little more R-rated, a little more one-liner, a little more deadpan delivery. And I was definitely kind of doing Drake Saylor when I first started.
Yeah, I like him too. That young comedian special he was on had some pretty big, pretty heavy hitters on it. I think David Spade was on that. I think Rob Schneider
Right.
was on that. I was just
Yeah.
looking up a book I read again for comedy fans that are interested in checking that either Drake Sather out or that era. There's a book, and it was written by another comic that was on that show, Fred Stoller.
Yeah, Fred.
Who
I'm a big Fred Stoller fan. Yeah, he's great.
I think he ended up doing a bit more acting than stand up. I know he had some guest
Right.
spots on Seinfeld. So it's called 5 Minutes to Kill.
Right.
How the HBO Young Comedian special changed the lives of 1989's funniest comics, and it's a really cool inside look of that show and who those people were. And then he follows through with where everybody went. But yeah, Drake Sather, dark stuff, and tragically is no
Right.
longer with us. And that's a guy that I would say his style of delivery was very locked in that time period. There was
Sure.
cadences to people at that era, but the joke writing you can take forward to today, 40 years later, 30 years, just structure wise and the darkness, and learn how to learn something from that, by going back. It's such a great advantage too for younger comics starting out today with social media. You can go back on YouTube and literally sample every comedy that's ever been put on tape.
There, I mean, there's no barriers in terms of finding comedy now. You can
Mhm.
watch open mic level comedians on YouTube all the way up to some of the greatest people who ever did it. So, I mean, in terms of like a learning curve and learning fast and really developing, I don't think you can develop any faster than you can now. I mean, we have access, even like the books, the 5 Minutes to Kill, and some of the other books that comics have written about maybe the mechanics of stand up or their experience in show business and stuff. I mean, you can learn all those lessons now. And we live in this world of podcasts now where you can listen in on some of the best comedians discuss all different all different times in their career, from when they started to when they were struggling to getting their first break. And it's always interesting to me.
Yeah, you mentioned those master classes. I know Steve Martin has one, and talk about that. That would be the first guy, late 70s when I was in high school. That was the guy my friends and I latched onto. The first person where we were obnoxiously telling all of his jokes in the cafeteria
Oh
every
yeah.
day from his albums. So it's, yeah, great. Again, all those years later to be able to literally just go on your laptop and learn from the experience that guy had. So we talked about you starting by taking that class as sort of an interest to get out of the house. How long from the end of that class, and I think you said you had a graduation show, before you started to maybe go to open mics regularly? And how did that fit in with what was going on in your life then? You mentioned being married and already having two kids and a full-time job as a teacher. So how did that all mesh together?
Well, fortunately for me, my kids were at an age where they went to bed very early, and my wife was a teacher as well. So we had a very structured 9 to 5 kind of basic schedule during the week where things kind of shut down early at my house. And I found that once everything shut down, I was free to go out and go to a mic and get some comedy in. So I continue to go to the Lark mic every Monday after the class. And then after about 5 or 6 weeks of that, one of the local comedians said, there's more mics. There's other mics and stuff that we can go to. Some of them were comedy mics and some of them were mixed mics where they allowed you to do comedy if you worked clean. And I kind of got on this schedule of just going out as much as I could. And I continued to just hammer mics. My first year doing comedy, 2013, I did 220 sets, and
Wow.
which in Albany, in a smaller market, is you're really hitting it hard. And I would go to mics all the way out to Utica. I would go into Western Massachusetts, into the Berkshires, or anywhere I could go to get up. I would get up. And about 8 weeks after I started, the local comedy club, the Comedy Works, had a room in Albany, and they were starting Tuesday night tryout shows where 10 comedians would go up and do 5 minutes. Or no, I think it was 10 minutes. They'd have like 8 to 10 comedians would do 10 minutes. And if you won the competition that night, you got to host the Friday Night Late Show. So pretty much on Tuesdays, the whole scene was there, and people from other scenes would come out because it was an opportunity to start doing stand up in a club. So 2 months in, I did my first, it was January, I did my first set at the Comedy Works, and they would videotape the set for you professionally. You could pay an extra $20 and get that set, digitally, and they put a bumper on it and stuff, and in the front and the back. And it seemed like that would be something that was really, this was even before like the huge YouTube boom where everybody had videos online and stuff. So everybody kind of wanted a recording of their performance. So started doing those shows. You could go up once a month. They would have a show every week, but you could only sign up for once a month to get in. And had good showings at the first two shows. And then in March, I won and was able to host the Friday Night Late Show at the Comedy Works. I think it was like March 14th or something like that. I did my first set in a club. So not long after I started, about 4 months after I started.
You probably did what, maybe 10 or 15 minutes. Did you have any anxieties about having enough material that early on?
Yeah, yeah, always. I would recite the set, and it was one of those things where, like, in the beginning, like when I had 10, I had a solid 10, but I only had 10. It wasn't like now where we develop some material. Somebody says to do 10, you can just pick and choose from whatever you have and just have a nice set with it. There was a time where it's like if I forget that one joke, I can't go back to it because I'm further along in the set. So I used to recite the set list, the bullet points in my head, and I'd always have it written out on a card just in bullet point form of that's that bit, couple jokes on this, couple jokes on that, and to have my 10. And then yeah, it was I had a good 10. And then once you start working in the clubs and you start doing more 10-minute sets, the material will grow, and eventually you'll get more stuff. You start getting rid of the stuff that's not as strong, and working in new stuff that's better. But yeah, it's nerve-wracking in the beginning because you don't want to you also feel like you're trying out all the time. You don't want to have a bad set when you first start.
Right. The first time I ever hosted a weekend, what you could call closest to my home club would be the Syracuse, New York Funny Bone. And I asked a bunch of friends who had been hosting up there about the mechanics of the show. I was more worried about that. What do I say? How should I intro people? Should I do crowd work? And anyone who's ever been to a Funny Bone Club, they tend to play clips on a screen before you come up, and then the screen goes up and they play music, and then the house MC comes on and introduces the show and goes through all the mechanics, silence your cell phones. A friend of mine had told me, when you're standing off stage, just make sure you're ready to get up on stage when that screen goes up, when those clips are up, not telling me that the house MC was then going to come on. So this clip stopped, the music kicked in, the screen went up. I bounded on stage in the darkness. And as I'm getting on stage, I hear the house MC come on and say, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Funny Bone," and then go through his 45 seconds of intros while I'm already standing on stage in the dark. And it's going through my head like, that's it. I'll never get hired here again. I blew it. I said something later to the GM, and she said, I wasn't even watching. I didn't
Right.
even notice. But those moments can be so nerve-wracking because you feel like this is my chance to go get in a legit club. And yeah, so things went pretty smoothly though for you the first few times.
Yeah, no, nothing major happened. I did learn about the mechanics of the show, and it's different in a mom and pop club than in a big kind of corporate room like the Funny Bone. So, I'd have a lot more direct contact with the manager and the owner and the wait staff. And I did learn early on that it's very important to have a good working relationship with the wait staff at any comedy club, because they're kind of the lifeblood of the club. And you have to make sure that, they really are in tune with what's going on, not just from a serving point of view, but also from a performance point of view. And I learned later that they used to have a lot of input on those Tuesday night shows of who they thought was bringing it and who they thought was getting better each time they showed up and performed, and who was bringing people out to the shows. So really, the wait staff is really where it's at in terms of making yourself a valuable member of the club, of the team.
So you said you
Yeah.
started in 2012. So we're 11 years on. As that time has gone on, has it been sort of a slow ramping up of getting more involved in comedy, or have you kept it pretty steady because you're still working full time?
Right.
And maybe the kids are older now. I don't know if your kids are still in the house, but
Yeah, they're 19 and 17 now. I have a son that's a senior in
okay.
high school and a daughter that's a junior in college. So,
Okay.
and so that's changed quite a bit. But I've been doing comedy the whole time through since. So yeah, in October, or November, it was 10 years. So I'm into my 11th year now. And it's for me, it's been pretty much doing as much comedy as I could possibly do while still keeping the day job. Because for
Mm.
me, leaving the day job was never an option. I was 15 years into my career as a teacher, 10 years into my marriage. And I knew nothing was going to change with that. So I'm currently 4 or 5 years away from retirement, depending on just circumstances with making sure I'm all set, retired and stuff. But yeah, I've done as much comedy as I can do. And I've actually been pretty fortunate because, you know, in the Albany area between the two clubs, the Comedy Works and the Funny Bone, and the people booking shows around here, I'm able to work pretty much 40 to 45 weekends a year. I stay really busy. And a lot of headlining acts, when I first started as an MC, they couldn't believe I was out working every weekend because it's very hard to get work in the beginning as an MC. I mean, and I actually got a lot of work from a guy named Aaron David Ward who booked one-nighters. He had something called the Not Too Far From Home Comedy Tour, and it was a string of one-nighters from Elks Lodges to theaters to bar shows to everything. So I was willing to work for him in the beginning and host and do things like drive 4 hours to go do an Elks Lodge to make 50 or 75 bucks and drive back. And, you know, I don't know if anybody else is willing to do that, but in the beginning, I was definitely willing to do whatever it took to just be on the show, just to work, even if it was doing 10 to 15 minutes to host and, you know, drive all that way and help with the setting up and the breaking down of the equipment and all the things that go into putting on an independent show. So I actually got a big education in road comedy and the business of comedy from working with Aaron. So yeah, I haven't stopped. The only thing that limits me from working is just trying to get shows, and you're kind of at the mercy of clubs that will or won't book you. So you know, I work as much as I can.
Well, it's interesting that name, Not Far From Home tour, because I looked at your schedule before we started, and you tend to stay in upstate New York a lot, Western Mass.
Sure.
Uh, is there any plan after you're retired, when you have a little bit more time, you don't have to worry about getting up the next morning
Right.
to teach, to maybe start branching out further in the region?
I do as much as I can where I can get back because I can't take days off during the school year.
Mhm.
So I've recently been passed to work for Carnival Cruise Line. So my goal is to do that more in the summer and then transition into cruise ships more when I'm retired. It's good money and steady work. But I've done the bookings, you know, a little bit farther away, either when I have a long weekend from school or when I can get to and from the gigs. I've done Long Island. I go down to Poughkeepsie in Jersey. Just got booked to South Carolina for this summer, and have gone out to Worcester and Boston. So you know, I've gone out to Rochester, and so for me, it's probably a 3 or 4 hour drive circle, you know, to get to and get back. So I've actually turned down a lot of offers to work in faraway places because people don't know that I'm a teacher. Like I've gotten some offers to go places and work some different places, but I'm like, I can't do it. I can't, if it's a Thursday through Sunday, I just can't pull it off during the school year. So I work around my teaching schedule.
Am I right? You teach on the elementary school level?
Yeah, I'm an elementary phys ed teacher.
Okay. Do your students know you do stand-up comedy?
I never told them, but the longer I've been doing it, they find out because their parents and relatives and neighbors go to shows. So they'll come in on a Monday and go, "My parents saw you at your show
Oh,
over
that's
the
cool.
weekend. They were there, you know." So, and then once the kids know, like they'll come up and tell me jokes or something, or they'll tell me that their parents are coming to a show. My parents are coming to see you this weekend, or, you know, somebody that they know is coming to see me. So, yeah, they know.
That's cool. The cruise thing is interesting. The cruise ship thing, is that if you have discussed that with your wife, or you're kind of saying, hey, we'll get some vacations out of this too when we retire?
I mean, that's the plan. If we end up snowbirding it and having a place down south and have us up north, or if it's just straight up just traveling to do the cruises, it's a nice second income in retirement, and it will allow me to just keep performing and you know, just keep moving forward. Just keep doing it as much as I can.
Yeah. As you look forward towards that retirement and you'll have more time to do stand up, is there a desire to do it week after week, or do you think you're going to be more choosy about it, do things that are interesting, or are you trying to get to a certain, level of booking?
Well, like ideally, I would do as much comedy as I can, but realistically, I've kind of been fortunate to have a good day job because I've never had to do comedy to pay my bills. I've never had to do it to as my sole source of income. So I've never had to be desperate in terms of where I wanted to work. And the longer I've done it, the more I've turned down gigs if I thought it was too far to go for too little money, or if it's somewhere I've gone and it wasn't very good, I'm not in a hurry to go back. But, my goal is to just always do it. So yeah, I mean, I'll work as much as I can, but honestly, I can't predict what I'm going to feel like 5 years from now. I won't know if my priorities will be different. There might be grandchildren, there might be retirement things, there might be traveling issues, just the natural progression of aging. I might feel different, but from where I am right now, I would ideally like to do comedy full time when I'm retired from teaching. At least, until I don't want to do it. I'd like to try it full time as a headliner. I think that would be fun.
Right. Well, that's great. How old are you right now?
I'm 50.
50. Okay. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, part of what you touched on is the age physically, the traveling, whether you're doing a lot of driving and how many miles you want to do in one
Right.
night, and the recovery time afterwards, which will be different when you don't have to get up at 7 a.m. to go back in to teach. That'll probably be
Right.
a nice luxury. What about things like, I don't think you've done an album. Do you have any plans to put out an album or something like that at some point?
Well, I've been approached to do a dry bar special, to go out to Utah and do one of those. So it's good to get some material done. I've seen some comedians get some traction on that.
Mhm.
And I've also talked to a lot of comedians about getting the stuff on satellite radio, because you can make the sound exchange money off of that. And if you can work clean, which I have a lot of material that's clean and can be made squeaky clean, that there's a demand for that, for clean comedy. So those are some of the things I've thought about. The hard thing about it is my, like, kind of path to creating material and stuff is because I'm not doing it full time all the time with no other responsibilities. That it's not like I don't want to take an hour and burn it and then have to start over fresh, because I don't really have the luxury of just starting over. I need the material that I have to work. So as I'm developing material, it comes, and I'm always writing new stuff and trying new stuff. But the thought of right now, for me, 10 years in, of taking all my best stuff, putting it out there, and then never being able to do it again, is kind of terrifying to start over, especially as I'm trying to climb the ladder from feature to headliner and headline more.
Yeah.
I need everything I've got right now.
Yeah, I'm in the same position. And that's an interesting aspect of being older. If you're 25, 27, and you've gotten to the point where you've got enough for an album, the number of people that just turn them out and then they just start from scratch because they have their whole life in front of them to develop that next hour. So is that an element
Sure.
of it at your age, you think? Because I certainly think this. I'm 8 years in, and I'm already 61, and I write such short jokes. It takes so long. It's taken me 4 or 5 years to get to the point where I have enough material. Although I would like to do an album, I think about, well, but once that's done and you said you've committed that and burned that material, how long am I gonna start over? How many more years is it
Yeah.
gonna take me to do the next bit? So that's
Right.
certainly a consideration that comes with the age.
Yeah, my goal is two. If I could do two monster hours, I would consider that a real success. For somebody starting at 40 like me, doing it with a day job for 15 years, I think if I could turn out two killer hours, that would be a great accomplishment for me. And I feel like I've got one right now, and probably have a solid hour 15, hour 20 if needed to be used. I don't feel confident if I was to just take an hour and then have to start over brand new. It would, the thought of taking like 5 years to turn that over, because I'm not somebody, if I was in New York City and I was banging out 5 sets a night, I could see the material turning over much faster than it does. But for me, it's a little bit of a slower process than for some pro comics, just because of the constraints of, full-time work, family, and everything else. So I do as much as I can. I write every day, and I'm refining the act every day, listening to the old sets, doing everything I'm supposed to do, but I'm not doing it. I don't have all 24 hours of the day to do that.
Yeah, and that's one disadvantage of us being in smaller scenes is just not being able to get on stage as often to test the stuff out. A
Right.
lot of things you said here, I have the impression you're very organized and regimented and approach everything with stand up very professionally. Do you think part of maybe having a full-time job before that and the responsibilities of kids and a house and all that, do you think that had an influence on how you approached comedy?
I started from the beginning with a sense of urgency. Like, there was a sense of urgency to get good enough to host in the clubs, and then there was a sense of urgency to be good enough to feature. And there, for me, there's just always been a sense of urgency to put the work in and do as much as you can to just keep moving forward. Because I know that I don't have the time. You know, I'm not looking at like from a 20-year-old's perspective, like I have all the time in the world to do this, because I just know that I don't. And even in my day-to-day life, I don't have all the time in the world because I have other responsibilities. But you know, what slows me down in some ways, I think, has made me better in other ways and made me more bookable, because I am professional and I am conscientious and I am easy to work with. And I do show up ready to work. And I don't do things like get drunk before a show or act irresponsibly. I show up on time and kind of, all the things that it takes to be a responsible grown up, or all the things that kind of I brought as a new comedian. And I feel like that helped me get work right away. And I also have a life of experience by starting later. I have things to talk about because I've lived life, so what could hurt you in some ways can help you in other ways. So I always just try to think about, what can I do? What do I bring that will help me in any situation, whether it's, just the actual writing of the material and practicing the material, and also from the business standpoint of getting booked and maintaining a career and trying to work as much as we can.
That can be an overlooked aspect, is just the professionalism of it. You might get a booking over someone else, or a producer or a GM might want to work with you again because you were more professional and you're reliable. And yeah, I do think that comes with the aging thing, is you've had some experience of dealing with things in your life where you've had to have responsibilities. It also makes, to me, it makes the stand-up part of it seem like, this isn't that difficult to be professional at this, compared to
Right.
raising children, keeping a marriage together, owning a home, having a full-time job. So I do
Sure.
think that's a nice advantage of the aging thing. What about, besides the sense of urgency, do you feel any other disadvantages to the age? Do you ever feel like you're not who somebody's looking for? And we could touch on the social media part of it now too. How do you feel
Sure.
about approaching that stuff?
Yeah, being an older guy, being a guy who's an older guy but a younger comic, like an older guy, newer comic, I've always felt a little bit out of place. I don't know how it feels with you, but the comedians who were always at my level that I started with were always 20 or 30 years younger than me, or much younger than me. And so there's a difference in where your life is going and what your goals are. So it's like I have to, it kind of freed me in a way, because I knew very early on that I had to pursue my own path. I couldn't look at what some other comedians are doing. I wasn't going to move to a big city. I wasn't going to really necessarily pursue industry type stuff and television appearances and stuff like that, because I have the full-time job. So I kind of am always assessing what can I do, and how can I get better. So I've always kind of had the mindset of nobody can keep you from getting good. Nobody can prevent you from improving as a writer and a stand-up, because you're the one that has to do all the work. So it doesn't matter what market you're in, or what rooms you're playing. If you really want to pursue it, and you're constantly working on your act, and you're constantly keeping in touch with what's going on in comedy in terms of bookings and the professional kind of side of it that you want to pursue. I guess if it was different for me, I probably had less dreams than a lot of younger comedians. I was very realistic and kind of pragmatic about what I could and couldn't do. So, and I've seen the industry change just in the 10 years that I've been doing it. I've seen late night, a lot of less emphasis on late night sets, getting on late night TV. Than when we were growing up, it used to be like a benchmark, like so and so got on the Tonight Show, or so and so got on the Late Night with David Letterman. Those things really meant something, and they still mean something now. But you're seeing a lot less return on the investment. Like you're not seeing people shot into superstardom from a late night set like you used to see, and or making big money or instantly becoming a headliner. I work with a lot of feature acts on the road and opening acts that just did 2 weeks before did a Conan O'Brien when that was still a relevant credit. And I guess for me, being a little older, I kind of missed the industry part, partially by choice. Like I kind of just looked at it and was like, I can't do that.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be doing what those guys are doing.
Is there any small part of it, you said you're not really interested in pursuing the late night, but is there any small part of you just in the back of your mind, because again, the era we grew up in and what a marker that was for people, is there ever a thought like, man, I would love to just get one under my belt just as a marker of an accomplishment of what?
I actually, from where I'm standing, like where I am right now, I would actually like a credit just to get more work, like for no
Okay.
fame or anything, just because there is a line drawn with, especially trying to book headliners, that credits matter. And the credits are different now because sometimes credits now are podcasts, and credits are it could be like a sketch show that you do on YouTube or something else. It doesn't always have to be through that late night route, but I've seen a lot of road comics and older comics get those dry bar credits, and that has, if the dry bar gets a lot of views, then that will get them work in the clubs and stuff. But you're burning a little more material, either 20 or a 40-minute set. But yeah, as far as the late night stuff, that's kind of it's in our DNA. Like growing up, I still look at that stuff, but I mean, a lot of those shows are gone now.
Yeah.
But I remember as a kid thinking, wow, that would be so great. And it's just like the sitcom thing. There was time where people were getting holding deals for $500,000 or $1 million from networks because people showed promise. They were just taking comedians and then turning their act into sitcoms. And I opened for the amazing Jonathan out in Syracuse one weekend. And after the show, he goes, I got good news and bad news for you. I go, what? He goes, that 10 minutes that you just did would have gotten you a holding deal in the 80s for about $500,000. And I go, what's the bad news? He goes, they don't do that anymore. He goes, they don't hand out that money anymore. And he goes, and the sitcoms are kind of going away too. But he goes, because you're like that guy next door and you're grumpy and you're talking about your wife and kids. And he goes, it's very relatable. He goes, if you were, in L.A. and somebody had come into the Comedy Store and seen you do that 10 minutes, he goes, they would have wanted to do something with a guy like you and try to make a show. So, for me, being a kid and knowing that that's what the path was, all those comedians got the shows. It's kind of cool because I'm kind of doing what they were doing when they first started out, and it ended up getting them, industry money or fame or whatever. So I know I'm kind of doing the right kind of thing, like, being funny on stage and developing material and having an identifiable persona on stage that people remember. So I kind of take pride in that.
Yeah, that's definitely a nice thing to hear, even if it's not still the possibility in this era that somebody
Right.
saw you that way. Again, just for the reason that that's what you grew up on. You're like, okay, I kind of am doing the same thing those people I grew up on were.
Yeah. It felt good when he said it. He's always a nice guy to me. I opened for him a couple of times. He was always nice to me.
Again, we touched a little bit on other credits that pop up, other places to get specials, dry bar and such. I know you're on, I think as far as I've seen, you're on Facebook and you're on Instagram. From what I see, you
Right.
mostly do it to announce shows. I don't see you putting a lot of clips out there at all. So have you put any effort into that or any plans to try to build up any kind of following or any base through the social media apps?
No, I haven't done anything in terms of clips. And what I've seen, the new trend is uh, online is crowd work clips, which I don't do at all. And the
Yeah.
reason, I understand the reason they do the crowd work clips is so you don't burn material and people see that you're out working all the time. And I've actually worked with people and seen on road gigs and then seen their set chopped up after, where they've just taken little clips here and there. But I don't know how far this is going to go with the clips, because I'm starting to see people run out of ideas. Like I'm starting to see, the longer that we're doing this whole topical clip crowd work thing, I'm starting to see a lot of people do kind of the same thing because there's only so many different things you can do with it. But that's what everybody's doing right now. And I don't necessarily know if it's working. I'd be interested to see, how it's doing. But I do know that people who are TikTok stars, I just worked with a woman, the one funny Lisa Marie at Albany Funny Bone, and she drew a decent sized crowd. And she's not a stand up comedian; she just does TikToks
Yeah.
and little 30-second clips and stuff. But I've never really had any interest of doing a lot of digital media stuff.
God, I got on TikTok. I even do a joke about it about a year and a half ago. And I was so reluctant to do it because I just felt like I don't fit that demographic. I don't look
Right.
like the kind of person that you're going to click on someone's thumbnail, with the gray hair and stuff. But I did it because I think we're supposed to. I started off doing it a lot, and now I only put up one clip a week because I feel the same thing with you. I'm still trying to build that first 45 minutes to an
Right.
hour. I don't want, not that I'm got millions of followers, but you feel like the stuff's out there already. How much, even if you build up a following, are those people going to want to listen to an album when they've been
Right.
watching the clips for 2 years? I got guilty of putting a couple crowd work things up recently too, just because I happened to have a show that was filmed where there was a couple of funny interactions, and I don't typically do crowd work as my act, but it almost felt like a relief to be able to put a couple of those clips up there rather than stuff that's in my set. So I
Right.
absolutely understand that mentality. But well, as we start to wrap things up here, I know we spoke before the podcast that you actually have a show tonight. We're recording on a Sunday. So you're going to be out doing a show on a Sunday night, and then you're right back at work on Monday
Sure.
morning at the
Yeah.
9 to 5. So there's that hard working thing there, but probably the drive isn't too far. So you can get back home and be in bed in time.
Oh yeah, this one's 20 minutes away. Yeah,
Perfect.
it's actually a local show. A guy named Jay LaFar, who's originally from my area, actually like the Glens Falls area, now lives in San Antonio, Texas, and he's a working comedian, and he's comes home a couple times a year, and he booked a bunch of shows, and then he just threw this bar show in at a brewery and on a Sunday just before he flies back. So it'll be good to see Jay and some of my other friends and do a show tonight.
And that's a good distance from home for a school night.
Absolutely.
Well, Dan, thanks very much for talking to us. I want to give you a chance to plug whatever social media you want to if you're on there, and also any other shows you're doing, maybe in the upcoming weeks in May, for example.
Sure. I'm on Facebook and Instagram, and best place to see where my schedule is going to be is just the homepage of my Facebook. I've made the one cover photo, my dates now. So I've got the show tonight. I had a show fall through, but next big one is going to be in Western Massachusetts, working for a guy named Charlie Nadler, who's starting to book shows in Western Massachusetts, and really good shows from what I hear. So that'll be the next big one. You guys can look for that on the social media, and I'm always appearing at clubs in upstate New York and into Massachusetts and stuff. So I'll be around. I'm always working.
Yes, absolutely. Go out and see Dan Geurin. He's very funny. We've had you at our club in Binghamton, and you were fantastic. And I absolutely recommend getting out to see him. Well, thanks very much. And keep an eye on that retirement and those cruise ships and the sunshine, and keep writing. And hopefully we'll cross paths again very soon out there doing stand up.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Bill. This is fun.
All right, Dan, take care.
Thanks. You too.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to this episode of Never Better Than Late. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share with your friends.